Stop whatever you're doing right now. Because while America is counting its dead and watching gas prices climb toward $5 a gallon, while the news cycle is entirely consumed with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, there is another country sitting very quietly at the edge of all of this, and it is not watching passively. It is winning, systematically, deliberately, with a 5-step plan that was already running before the first American bomb fell on Iranian soil in February 2026, and most Americans have no idea it exists. This is not political commentary, and it is not a conspiracy theory. What I'm going to walk you through today is documented strategy. Decisions made in Beijing that are already showing up in oil market, in treasury bond auctions, in semiconductor factories in Chengdu, and in diplomatic meetings in Riyadh and Moscow that Western media is covering as footnote while the main story is the war. By the end of this video, you are going to understand that the US-Iran war is not a two-player game. There is a third player, and right now that third player is the only one positioned to come out of this stronger than when it started. Let's walk through it step by step. Before we get to the 5 steps, you need to understand one thing about how China operates at the strategic level, because it is fundamentally different from how America operates, and that difference is the key to everything that follows. America thinks in election cycles. 4 years at the outer edge, usually 2. Political decisions in Washington are calibrated against the next midterm, the next approval rating, the next news cycle. That is the structural reality of democratic governance, and it is not a criticism. It is simply a constraint. China's leadership operates on a different time axis entirely. The Communist Party's current strategic framework projects to 2049. That is not an aspirational tagline. That is a planning horizon. Concrete benchmarks, specific target, industrial roadmap, all calibrated toward a single moment. The 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. And the United States, distracted, divided, fighting a war in the Persian Gulf with one eye on the next domestic headline, is, from Beijing's vantage point, not paying attention. Here is what China sees when it looks at the US-Iran war. It sees an adversary that just committed enormous military, financial, and political resources to a conflict in a region China does not need to control through force because China already controls it through commerce. It sees oil markets in chaos, which means buying opportunity. It sees the dollar system under pressure, which means acceleration of its own alternative financial architecture. It sees American military assets clustered in the Gulf, which means the Pacific window is more open than it has been in 20 years. And it sees a moment to step into the role of the responsible global power, while America plays the role of the belligerent one. 5 opportunities, 5 steps, all running simultaneously. Let's start with the most immediately consequential piece, because this one is already landing in your gas bill, and most analysts are describing it backwards. The standard framing goes like this: China is buying Iranian oil at a discount, and that is bad for American sanctions policy. That framing is correct, but it misses the strategic depth of what China is actually doing. This is not opportunism. This is a structural energy acquisition campaign that the US-Iran war just massively accelerated. Here are the numbers. Prior to February 28, 2026, China was already purchasing approximately 1.4 million barrels of Iranian crude per day, roughly 90% of Iran's total oil exports. Those purchases ran through shadow tanker fleets and non-SWIFT payment channels, meaning they were technically sanction-evading transactions, but practically impossible to stop without confronting China directly. The revenue flowing to Tehran from those sales came to approximately $31.2 billion annually, nearly half of Iran's entire government budget covered by Chinese purchasing. Since Operation Epic Fury began and the Strait of Hormuz closed, something important has changed. Iran is now selling oil to China at a discount that the Eurasia Group estimates runs between $18 and $22 per barrel below the global Brent benchmark. At $130 Brent, which is where the market sat in mid-March 2026, Iran is selling to China at roughly $108 to $112. On 1.4 million barrels per day, that discount represents approximately $25 to $31 million in savings for Chinese buyers every single day. Every day the war continues and the strait stays closed, China is banking roughly $25 to $31 million in energy cost savings relative to what every other major oil importing nation is paying. But the discount acquisition is only the first layer. The more durable layer is the long-term infrastructure Beijing is building around that energy relationship. The 2021 China-Iran Comprehensive Strategic Partnership committed up to $400 billion in investment over 25 years. That agreement covered oil and gas infrastructure, pipelines, refinery development, and port facilities, all of which deepened China's physical claim on Iranian energy resources for decades. The Wall Street Journal reported in October 2025 on a separate arrangement through the Chinese state enterprise Sinosure that may have channeled an additional $8.4 billion into Iranian energy infrastructure in 2024 alone. China is not merely buying cheap oil during a crisis. China is building the infrastructure to own Iranian energy for a generation. Now here's where this lands directly in your wallet. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed as of mid-March 2026. Brent crude trades above $130 per barrel. Gas prices in the United States jumped nearly $0.80 in 2 weeks. Goldman Sachs has revised U.S. inflation projections upward to between 2.9 and 3.3%. Every barrel China locks up through discount long-term contract is a barrel the global market cannot access freely. The tighter the global supply, the higher the price Americans pay at the pump. China's energy acquisition strategy is not separate from your gas bill. It is one of the mechanisms driving it. This step operates on a longer time horizon than the others, but the U.S.-Iran war just compressed that timeline in ways that matter enormously for your retirement account, your savings, and the long-term value of every dollar you hold. To understand step 2, you need to understand what the petrodollar actually is. After World War II, the United States and Saudi Arabia struck a deal that quietly ran the global economy for 50 years. Gulf states would price their oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. Every country on Earth that needed oil, which was every country on Earth, had to acquire dollars first. That permanent global demand for dollars is what gave the United States the ability to run persistent trade deficits, issue debt at favorable rates, and fund a military apparatus that no other country could afford. The dollar did not become the world's reserve currency because America's economy was simply the best. It became the reserve currency because oil was priced in it and oil was non-optional. The International Monetary Fund confirmed in 2024 that the dollar still accounts for approximately 59% of global foreign exchange reserves. No other currency is even close. China has been trying to chip away at that arrangement for 15 years with limited success. The yuan currently sits below 5% of global foreign exchange reserve. The infrastructure for a genuine dollar alternative payment systems, yuan-denominated energy contract, multilateral settlement mechanisms that bypass SWIFT existed on paper but lacked the critical mass to challenge dollar dominance in practice. The U.S.-Iran war changed the calculus. Here is what happened within 2 weeks of Operation Epic Fury's launch. 3 Gulf states that had been quietly exploring yuan-denominated oil settlement mechanisms accelerated those conversations. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange, China's yuan-denominated oil futures market, saw trading volume increase sharply as buyers and sellers who had previously used dollar channels began looking for alternatives in the uncertainty. Russia, already conducting most of its energy trade in rubles and yuan after 2022 sanctions, deepened its coordination with Chinese financial institutions to root around the SWIFT-dependent dollar system. At the July 2025 BRICS summit, the coalition, which now accounts for more than 40% of the world's population and a combined GDP of $31.5 trillion, endorsed a roadmap for a cross-border payment system that would allow member states to settle energy transactions without touching dollar-denominated infrastructure. That roadmap moved from aspirational to urgent the moment the Strait of Hormuz closed, and every non-Western oil importer began asking the same question. What happens if dollar-denominated oil markets seize up entirely? The answer: China has been building for 15 years. UN settlement, CIPS as an alternative to SWIFT, bilateral currency swap lines with 39 central banks as of 2025 suddenly looked less like an academic exercise and more like an operational necessity. President Trump recognized the direction of travel when he stated plainly to his cabinet in July 2025 that BRICS was set up to hurt us, set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar off as the standard. Let me be precise about the limits here because intellectual honesty matters. The dollar is not going to lose reserve currency status this year or next year. The yuan at 5% of global reserves is not a threat to dollar dominance in the short run, but China's goal is not to replace the dollar in 2026. China's goal is to make American sanctions less effective, to build enough alternative financial plumbing that any country targeted by Washington can route around the dollar system rather than comply. On that narrower and more achievable goal, the strategy has already succeeded in measurable ways. Iran's oil revenue flows despite the most aggressive U.S. sanctions campaign in history. Russia's economy survived isolation from SWIFT. The tools of American financial power are demonstrably less effective than they were 10 years ago, and the U.S.-Iran war is providing the most compelling argument yet for every country watching to accelerate their own non-dollar contingency planning. Step 3. The Taiwan window. This is the step nobody in the American media wants to talk about directly, but every serious defense analyst in Washington is thinking about it, which is why you need to understand it clearly. The United States military is not unlimited. It is enormous, it is sophisticated, and it is capable of fighting across multiple theaters simultaneously, but not infinitely, not without degradation, and not without trade-offs. The moment Operation Epic Fury began and the carrier groups, the air assets, the intelligence resources, the logistics chains, and the command attention of the American military concentrated in the Persian Gulf theater, something happened in the Pacific. The density of American military presence and readiness in the Western Pacific thinned. The United States has maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity toward Taiwan since 1979. The practical military expression of that ambiguity is the permanent positioning of American naval and air assets in the Indo-Pacific, sufficient to make a Chinese military military operation against Taiwan unacceptably costly. That deterrence does not rest on a signed treaty obligation. It rests on China's calculation that the cost of taking Taiwan would be too high given American willingness and capability to respond. That calculation depends on a variable: how much of America's military capacity is available to respond, how quickly, and from where. As of March 2026, the answer to all three of those questions has changed. Multiple carrier strike groups are operating in or near the Persian Gulf theater. Ammunition stockpiles being drawn down in support of Israeli and American operations in Iran are stockpiles that are not sitting in Pacific Command depots. Intelligence assets, cyber warfare resources, and command-level attention that would normally be directed at the Indo-Pacific are focused on the Gulf. Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group, noted in February 2026 that Beijing is carefully assessing what this conflict does to America's bandwidth in the Pacific. Now here is the critical question: does this mean China is about to move on Taiwan? The answer is almost certainly not in the immediate term. The PLA's operational timeline for a Taiwan scenario, based on the most credible open source assessments from the RAND Corporation and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, projects readiness for a high confidence operation somewhere between 2027 and 2030. China is not ready to move today, and moving prematurely would be the kind of mistake that sets the entire 2049 project back by a generation. But the window being open is itself strategically useful to Beijing, even without action. Every month that American military assets remain committed in the Gulf is a month China uses to advance naval construction. The PLA Navy commissioned more new tonnage in 2024 than the U.S. Navy has launched in the past 3 years combined. It is a month for additional military exercises that produce operational learning. It is a month for further development of the anti-access and area denial systems specifically designed to raise the cost of American military intervention in a Taiwan scenario. The window does not need to be used to be valuable. Its existence changes the pace and the trajectory of everything China is building toward. This one connects directly to your retirement account, specifically to the technology sector valuations that have driven American equity returns for the past decade. So pay close attention here. American economic statecraft since 2022 has rested on a single strategic bet: that controlling the supply of advanced semiconductors gives the United States leverage over China's military and economic development that no amount of conventional military spending could replicate. The logic is sound. Advanced chips are the foundational input for everything from artificial intelligence to hypersonic missile guidance systems. If you control the fabs, the factories that manufacture the most advanced semiconductors, and you control the tools required to build those fabs, you control the pace at which any adversary can develop next-generation military and commercial technology. The Biden administration imposed the most sweeping semiconductor export controls in American history in October 2022. The Trump administration tightened them further in 2025. The cumulative effect was to restrict China's access to the leading-edge chips produced by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and the advanced lithography machines produced by the Dutch company ASML that are required to manufacture those chips. Here is what the United States assumed would follow from those controls: China would be unable to develop its own advanced semiconductor manufacturing capability quickly enough to matter. The gap in chip technology would widen, not narrow. American leverage would compound. Here is what actually happened. China's government committed the equivalent of $150 billion to domestic semiconductor development between 2022 and 2026 through a combination of state investment funds, subsidized financing, and directed procurement. Huawei's release of the Mate 60 Pro in August 2023, a smartphone powered by a domestically produced 7-nanometer chip manufactured by SMIC without ASML's most advanced equipment, was the first public signal that the American assumption was wrong. Michael Schmidt, a semiconductor analyst at Bernstein Research, described the development as a significant demonstration of Chinese manufacturing capability that the industry had not expected to see for several more years. The US-Iran war accelerated this sprint in a specific way. The conflict provided political justification within China for emergency-level resource allocation to the semiconductor program. State media framed the war as confirmation of the threat environment. If the United States is willing to launch 900 strikes in 12 hours against a country it designated an adversary, what does that say about what it might do economically or militarily to a China that remains technologically dependent on American-controlled supply chains? The political consensus within the CCP for extreme investment in semiconductor self-sufficiency, which was already strong, became absolute. And here is where this reaches your retirement account. American technology companies, Nvidia, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Qualcomm, derive a meaningful portion of their revenue from the Chinese market. As China successfully develops domestic alternatives, that revenue base erodes. The Gulf sovereign wealth funds of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait that have invested heavily in those same companies are under under pressure from the war's economic disruption, meaning the flow of capital that has helped support those valuations faces headwinds from two directions simultaneously. The Goldman Sachs recession probability of 25% as of mid-March 2026 reflects precisely this kind of multi-front pressure on American corporate earnings. Technology sector valuations that drove the S&P 500 to its historic highs are exposed to a China semiconductor independence story that most retail investors have not priced in. The fifth step is the most elegant and the most underestimated, and it cost China almost nothing to execute. The United States entered the U.S.-Iran war carrying a specific global reputation as the country that, alongside Israel, decided to militarily target a sovereign nation's nuclear infrastructure and assassinate its head of state. Regardless of your view on whether that decision was justified, the optics in the global south, across Africa, across Southeast Asia, across Latin America, across the Middle East states that were not directly aligned with Washington, were complicated at best and alienating at worst. China entered this same moment carrying a very different narrative. In March 2023, Beijing brokered the normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, an achievement that American diplomacy had been attempting to produce for decades and that the United States greeted with a mixture of surprise and discomfort. That single diplomatic coup repositioned China as a constructive force in the Middle East in the eyes of every Arab government. When the war started in February 2026, Beijing immediately called for a ceasefire, offered to host negotiations, and framed its position as that of a responsible power protecting global energy stability against reckless unilateralism. That framing may be self-serving, but it is finding an audience. The global south is not a monolith, but its general posture, shaped by the memory of colonialism, by the experience of conditionality-laden Western development finance, and by decades of watching American military interventions produce outcomes that look better in press conferences than on the ground, was already inclined to hear a China as responsible alternative narrative. The U.S.-Iran war handed Beijing the single most useful piece of supporting evidence for that narrative that any amount of diplomatic investment could have produced. Concretely, China is using this repositioning to accelerate three specific diplomatic objectives. First, the expansion of BRICS into a genuine economic bloc. Saudi Arabia joined BRICS in 2024, and the UAE's accession process is ongoing. Second, the negotiation of bilateral currency swap agreements and trade deals denominated outside the dollar system, with countries whose governments are publicly uncomfortable with the war's optics. Third, the establishment of China as the indispensable mediator in any eventual Iran conflict resolution, a role that would give Beijing structural influence over the terms of whatever post-war regional order emerges. Sun Tzu's most frequently quoted principle, that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, sounds like a fortune cookie in translation. As geopolitical strategy applied to the U.S.-Iran war by Beijing, it is precise, documented, and actively operational. Now step back and look at all five pieces together, because the power of this strategy is not in any single step. It is in how the steps interlock and reinforce each other in ways that make the system extraordinarily difficult to disrupt. The energy acquisition strategy in step 1 funds China's broader economic resilience. Cheap oil reduces Chinese industrial input costs at precisely the moment when American inflation is squeezing domestic purchasing power. The dollar detox in step 2 makes U.S. sanctions, the primary non-military tool America has for pressuring Beijing, structurally less effective, creating the financial insulation that protects the energy and technology investment in steps 1 and 4. The Taiwan window in step 3 does not require action. Its mere existence accelerates the military development program and shapes the calculations of every American defense planner without costing Beijing a single soldier. The semiconductor sprint in step 4 reduces the chokehold that American export controls represent and builds the technological foundation for every military and economic ambition in the 2049 framework. And the diplomatic repositioning in step 5 provides the political cover and the global coalition that makes all four of the other steps less costly and more durable. Remove any single step and the others continue. Disrupt 2 and the system adapts. This is not a plan that has a single point of failure, and that is not an accident. It is the product of decades of strategic planning by an institution with a 75-year planning horizon. Here is the part of this conversation that the strategic analysis exists to serve: your actual life and your actual financial situation over the next 12 to 24 months. The U.S.-Iran war has already raised your gas prices by nearly 80 cents per gallon. Goldman Sachs has assigned a 25% probability to a U.S. recession in 2026. Food prices are expected to climb within 60 days as fertilizer and diesel costs work their way through the agricultural supply chain. Your mortgage rate climbed 30 basis points in 2 weeks, and your equity portfolio, if you hold significant technology exposure, faces headwinds from the China semiconductor independence story that most financial advisors have not yet incorporated into their client conversations. China's strategy does not make any of those pressures easier. In fact, China's step 1, the energy acquisition acquisition play is one of the structural forces keeping global oil prices elevated even as American strategic reserves are drawn down. China buying cheap Iranian oil does not bring global prices down. It tightens the global market and keeps Brent above $130 while American families pay $5 at the pump. The honest answer about what you can do with this analysis is the same as what any serious understanding of geopolitics produces. You cannot change what Beijing decides to do. You cannot alter the strategy of a government operating on a 75-year planning horizon, but you can understand it, and understanding it tells you things that matter practically. It tells you that the forces keeping energy prices elevated are not going away when the Iran ceasefire arrives, because China's structural energy acquisition strategy predates this war and will outlast it. It tells you that the technology sector headwinds are structural, not cyclical, and that portfolio exposure to companies dependent on Chinese market revenue deserves a harder look than most retail investors have given it. It tells you that the dollar's reserve status is not going to collapse this year, but the long-term trajectory of de-dollarization is real and accelerating, which has implications for how you think about inflation protection over a 10-year horizon. Let me be precise about where this analysis runs into its own edges, because intellectual honesty is what separates serious analysis from the kind of confirmation bias content that is everywhere right now. China's strategy has real vulnerabilities. The Chinese economy carries a real estate debt overhang that has produced significant deflationary pressure. The property sector represents approximately a quarter of Chinese GDP, and the ongoing deleveraging is a genuine drag. Youth unemployment in China hit record levels in 2023, and the structural employment challenge has not been resolved. Taiwan is not simply a geopolitical prize, it is a military operation of extraordinary complexity that the PLA has not demonstrated the ability to execute successfully, and China's own energy security is partially dependent on the same Gulf stability that the US-Iran war is disrupting. A prolonged global recession triggered by a sustained strait closure damages Chinese export markets and Chinese growth alongside everyone else's. The Soviet Cold War offers the most instructive parallel. The Soviet Union ran a sophisticated, multi-decade strategy of asymmetric competition against the United States, accumulating real advantages along the way. And then the internal contradictions, economic stagnation, legitimacy deficits, the costs of empire, overwhelmed the external strategy. China's version of that strategy is more sophisticated, more economically grounded, and more carefully sequenced than the Soviet approach ever was. But it is not immune to the same category of internal pressure. Xi Jinping's governance has produced a more centralized and less error-correcting political system than China operated under in the 1980s and 1990s. Centralization reduces the speed of strategic adaptation when surprises arrive. None of that changes the 5 steps currently running. It changes the confidence interval around how long they remain executable and how far they ultimately reach. 5 steps, all running simultaneously, all already operational as of March 2026. Step 1. The energy acquisition play. China is purchasing Iranian crude at discounts of $18 to $22 below Brent, accumulating long-term infrastructure ownership through the $400 billion China-Iran partnership and banking $25 to $31 million per day in energy cost savings that every other major oil importer cannot access. This is not opportunism. It is structural energy security being locked in during a window of American distraction. Step 2. The dollar detox acceleration. The US-Iran war has provided the most powerful political argument in a generation for every non-Western government to accelerate its own non-dollar financial infrastructure. BRICS payment mechanisms, UN oil settlement, and bilateral currency swaps are moving from aspirational to operational under crisis pressure that Washington created and Beijing is leveraging. Step 3. The Taiwan window. American military assets concentrated in the Persian Gulf have thinned Pacific readiness in ways that Chinese defense planners are carefully documenting and using to calibrate the pace of PLA modernization. The window does not need to be used to change Beijing's strategic calculus. Its existence is sufficient. Step 4. The semiconductor sovereignty sprint. China's $150 billion domestic chip development program has received emergency political reinforcement from a war that demonstrated to every CCP decision maker the cost of technological dependency on a country willing to launch 900 strikes in 12 hours. The chokehold that American export controls represent is being systematically relieved. Step 5. The diplomatic repositioning. China brokered Saudi-Iran normalization in 2023. China called for ceasefire in 2026. China is accumulating the global political capital to position itself as the indispensable mediator in whatever regional order follows this war, and to use that position to advance BRICS expansion, non-dollar trade, and bilateral relationships with every government made uncomfortable by American military action in the Gulf. 5 steps. 0 American shots fired at China. 0 Chinese soldiers deployed. And the country that emerges from this war with more leverage, more energy security, more financial architecture and more diplomatic capital than it had going in, is not the one doing the fighting. Share this with someone you care about, because understanding what is actually happening in the world right now is not a luxury. It is the starting point for every good decision you will make about your finances, your community, and your country going forward. The next video is already coming.